It is a real pleasure to be able to welcome you all here today for our Dialogues in Tech DEI. This one is Building Diverse Tech from the Ground Up. So welcome all, and thank you so much for joining us. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our wonderful moderator, Tiffani Lee, to introduce the speakers and to get the program started. Thank you. Tiffani?
Thank you, Leonie, and thanks everyone for joining us on a Friday afternoon for this dialogue. We are very fortunate today to have two real leaders in the tech industry joining us. Sarah Chen-Spellings, who is the co-founder of Beyond the Building, that was formerly the $1 billion fund, and she'll tell you how it came to change its name so quickly and what they're doing. And also Jason Clark, who is the executive director of Tech NYC as of January of this year. And we're really grateful that Jason is joining us while on parental leave after recently having a child. So Jason, thank you for joining us in what's likely a little bit of a sleep-deprived state. And I want to just start by giving each of you a chance to introduce yourselves. I think part of the value of these dialogues is giving people a chance to hear about what individuals are doing to really impact the sector and DEI in the sector, and potentially be motivated by some of the things that you're doing, and to think about ways that they can, in their spheres of influence, make an impact as well. So Sarah, I'm going to start with you and ask that you would share your background, your trajectory, and why you started Beyond the Billion.
Thanks, Tiffani. Really appreciate that. Hi, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're joining from. My name is Sarah Chen-Spellings, and I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Beyond the Billion, as mentioned, formerly known and relaunched as the $1 Billion Fund for Women. And hopefully that gives a little bit of a hint in itself. I'm Malaysian born, and my history into this journey is particularly begins when I sort of got looked into corporate venture capital. So I was a CVC myself, where I had something like 150 million to deploy together with a public listed Asian company. And that really got me hooked into working with great founders with great ideas that I truly believe, even till today, are continuing to solve some of the world's toughest challenges, even as we continue to evolve and as the challenges continue to evolve and adapt. And along the way, I realized, I grew up and I was working in Muslim majority Malaysia, that in the room, and I'm sure many of us around the table would resonate with this, I was very much the only one that looked like me, that sounded like me, and who had my unique lens into different issues. And I wanted to change that. I questioned where the women were. And there were women, of course, smart, amazing women that were engineers, that were scientists. So we're investing into later stage biotech companies at that point in time. And they were supporting the diligence work. But I realized a phenomenon where at 5 p.m. sharp, the women would check out because obviously they were married by a certain time, and that was expectation, and that they had to go and, take care of the children. But of course, within my group, there were, of course, married men with children as well. And I realized that they were not checking out at 5 p.m. And in fact, at that time, because I was still single and working my ass off, I would take the meetings with the US, right, at 8 p.m., at 9 p.m., which was the equivalent of 8 a.m. Eastern and 9 a.m. Eastern, whatever it took. And I realized over the years that these women were not getting the keys to the corner office, despite the great work that they were doing. And in fact, they were, in the words of Sheryl Sandberg, in many ways, they were not leaning in. And that really inspired me to start Lean In Malaysia, which has now grown to a network of over 7,000 women and men that are all about championing women in leadership. And that all started with me getting a couple of people around the table to say, there must be a better way. There must be role models who have figured it out, that have the obvious, I almost shrug and cringe at this term of work-life balance, because hopefully men are being asked these same questions, but they were not at that time in Malaysia. And so, what was a gathering of a couple of people that was supposed to be 10 people around the table to discuss ways to move forward and to bring ambition as you evolve in your career, became a meeting of 80, and then became 100. And the next thing I know, it was 1,000 people that were bought into this entire agenda. And of course, being who I am, and hopefully you'll get a little bit of flavor of that throughout this conversation. My view in doing things is always to do it sustainably, right? Not to rush into, to have big, hairy, audacious goals, but to build things fundamentally well and not to rush things. And part of what that was involved me bringing in the support of government, bringing in the support of different agencies, bringing the support of corporates, some of the big names from Microsoft, Dell, whoever that was within our realm in Malaysia and Southeast Asia at that time, to be fully supporting this move to get more women in leadership, to change that 5% number at that point in time of CEOs that were women. And that really got me, I guess, activated as a feminist. I used to call myself an accidental feminist because I didn't really come into this world wanting to be that advocate, but by just wanting to change the reality and questioning the world around me, I guess I got put into the position where I became activated in my beliefs that women deserve to be in these rooms that they earned and deserve to be seen, to be visible, to be heard, and to have their impact in the world. And I thought that was very important. And that carried on along the way. You know, my career brought me to the US because I was investing into US companies and I was looking for my next chapter and was keen to continue in venture capital. Lo and behold, I met my co-founder of Beyond the Billion, back then the $1 Billion Fund for Women, where she was brewing an idea of the $1 Billion Fund for Women, which of course piqued my interest because part of my journey, you know, you sort of see the two emerging themes of venture capital and women in leadership. And when the idea came about of, you know, how do we address the gender venture investment gap? I mean, imagine me, you know, a bright-eyed Malaysian girl coming to the US, which is supposed to be the beacon of innovation and diversity, equity, inclusion. And I was told that, guess what? Only 2.2% of venture capital in today's age, back then it was 2017, goes into women-founded companies. And even if you included gender diverse teams, that was 10 to 12%, which means today, ladies and gentlemen, 88% of all venture capital funding goes into all male teams. And that is the technology that you and I are using today. That is the lens of the world that we're seeing today, the innovations that we're seeing in the world. And again, you know, I felt compelled to do something about it. And that brought me to the $1 Billion Fund for Women, which is a global consortium of venture capital funds that have pledged to invest over $1 billion and are actively deploying that into female-founded companies. And I'll go into why this is and how we took the approach, but I don't want to take up too much time in this intro as well. But really, you know, we thought about a way that would mobilize capital quickly. You know, I think I mentioned early in the prelude, you know, we had the idea of maybe we should start a fund, maybe we should do this, but we realized that to change the system, we needed to work with the system and do things in a big way. And $1 billion was the big goal. And we could only have done it at that point in time with the help of many other funds that we built within our network. And so today we stand proud as a global consortium of over 100 funds now that have taken the pledge and are actively deploying over $1 billion of that. And 638 million of the first billion has been deployed. Happy to report, into close to 800 female-founded companies, of which 11 have been recognized as unicorns. So I'll pause right there. I'm sure there are many questions and a lot to unpack along the way, but really excited to be here. And thank you for having this important discussion.
Sarah, that's so exciting. And I think I read that you got to the billion in less than a year, like it was really quick. And so I know we want to hear about how you did that. What was the hook? What were the strategies that you used to do that? But first, I want to give Jason a chance to introduce himself. Jason is the Executive Director of Tech NYC as of January of this year and involved in some other things as well. And so Jason, I'll give you a chance to share your background and what motivates you to be active in this space.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for that. And thanks for organizing this important conversation. So like many of you, I am a lawyer. You know, I started off, working at a firm. I spent some time with a federal judge in the Southern District. And then I spent the next 9 years of my life working at the New York State Attorney General's office. And this issue of impact has always been important to me because, frankly, the reasons why I became a lawyer to begin with. You know, for me, the reason why I joined the Attorney General's office and frankly, why I wanted to become a lawyer is because my senior year in high school was the year that someone named Amadou Diallo, was shot 41 times by 3 plainclothes police officers. And this is back in 1999, before people were talking about stopping this. They were talking about some of these, issues that we've obviously seen reoccur and be a part of the narrative again over these last 5 years. a litany of other folks who have unfortunately lost their lives. But the shooting happened my senior year in high school, about 20 minutes away from where I was in the Bronx. And I remember after that feeling like, and after the officers, they were, and I think actually I can appreciate that in this conversation, which is that, the officers themselves, even though the shooting happened in the Bronx, and all the parties were from the Bronx, the actual trial happened up in Albany. And, it just really struck an idea in me, or a thought in me, which is that, people can give all these reasons as to why this happened, but it really didn't sound like justice. And it made me interested in becoming a lawyer and figuring out how we can be able to make an impact. And, at that time I had found that there was this office called the Attorney General's office in New York that had just filed this report on stop and frisk. Again, this is back in 1999. And I knew that maybe this is a place where I could get started and figure out a way to make a difference. So fast forwarding, many years later, I ended up working at the AG's office, spent a great deal of my career there, especially, as the deputy of our Harlem office. And then about a year ago, I was approached about this opportunity with Tech DEI. And it was interesting because, we were coming out of this pandemic, right? Or we were at least thought we were coming out. We're still we're still in some ways still deep into it, but at an opportunity where everyone's relationship with technology had changed. We had just elected a new mayor, Eric Adams, who had been talking a great deal about technology and the impact that that can have on our communities. And we also just had gotten a new governor at the time, Governor Kathy Hochul, who had been talking about making sure that we're investing more in small businesses. And it really made me think that, this could be a real inflection point where we think about, the relationship that we've had with technology because of the pandemic, had changed. The winds had changed in ways that, seem quite unique. And I started realizing that many of the reasons that made me want to become a lawyer, trying to figure out ways to fight for justice, this may actually be an opportunity to be able to do so from an economic justice standpoint. And again, as you mentioned, I'm relatively new to the role. I started earlier this year. But the reason why I decided that this may be the right time to be able to do this work is because of the impact it can have in our communities and making sure that folks, especially from underrepresented and underestimated backgrounds, have an opportunity to be able to have roles in upcoming, and I don't even want to say emerging because it's here now, but amazing industries like tech that can make sure that, as communities where we were talking about people of color, where we're talking about gender equity issues, that if we do this right, this could be a real moment for us. But at the same time, if we aren't intentional about the work that we do here, then just like many other moments in the past, it can actually solidify more some of the disparities that we've seen for way too long. So that's how I got to be in this seat and sitting on this Zoom call with all of you great folks.
That's great. Thank you. So Sarah, I want to go back to you. You mentioned that you like to build things sustainably, and you've built this consortium of funds very rapidly, it seems. And you also said that you were trying to address sort of some structural issues. So can you tell us what structural issues you're trying to address and what strategies you use to tackle them?
Yeah, thanks for that question. To address your first question on how we got to the billion so quickly, right? So part of the transition of the name was, sharing with the folks in DC here who will get it, is we were put on the stage with the CEO of Politico at that time, and we had just hit our $1 billion goal, right? So the goal was half the amount of what women were getting in 2017, and we thought it would frankly take us 10 years, right? My initial business plans was maybe this will take us 10 years. I'll have a full-time VC career on top of this, and I'll do this on the side, and let's see how we go from there. But we were very, very positively overwhelmed by the response. And I think the moment is important, as mentioned by Jason as well. It was fresh off the Me Too movement. So in 2017, all that was unraveling. And I think when we launched in October 2018 at the World Bank meetings in Bali, a lot of venture capital firms were looking for a way, an avenue to differentiate themselves, who wanted to put a stamp on their beliefs and to say that, hey, these toxic environments, that's not on, right? That's not acceptable. And we as a community have a bigger responsibility of advancing women and people of color, and doing so in a way that reflects our values. And so the $1 billion fund for women, when we came up with a pledge campaign, that became an easy mechanism for them to sort of step there and give their endorsement of what we believed in, what we all believed in, which is investing in women is just good business. It was not charity. We were getting the returns, and we wanted to make sure that the conversation on gender equality and gender equity is very much part of the discussion, right? And along the way, we were surprised that even some of the smaller funds that were ambitious in their goals were very quick to say yes. And I think that was all what helped us. So we worked with both emerging and established players. So we have firms that are, smaller in size in AUM to 1.2 billion assets under management firms. And I think that was important, a message as well, to say that, hey, no matter how small you are, because the complaint is like, oh, I can't do diversity now, I'm too small. Right. But it starts from day one. And I think that was a great message to speak to in the wider venture ecosystem, and to do so in such a big fashion of the $1 billion fund for women. Right. Frankly, we put a lot of the founders put our names on the line here. What would happen if we didn't get it? I guess we would get closer to the goal, but it was important to also create that ripple effect of putting the billion next to a woman, that the word woman, and that in itself really helped us move forward. And so when we hit the $1 billion goal, we said, well, the question from the CEO of Politico was, well, what next? 2 billion, 10 billion. And that's where we decided, let's not cap it. There's a lot more work to be done. And beyond, of course, the name itself was also to widen the aperture of how we were approaching the problem. So what we realized in the first year was that the funding to female founders, the problem of the gender venture investment gap did not stop at sort of if you think about the supply chain of capital, it did not stop at the female founder to the VC alone. A lot of people, people who are not in the industry may think, oh yeah, the female founders, they're not getting to the VCs. And some even believe that the pipeline is an issue, that there are no women, right? But I can assure you, if you look into my inbox every single day, there are a couple or even, tens or hundreds of deals that I'm looking at from female founders that are innovating across ag tech, clean tech, biotech, you name it, that are shaping our future. And I'm so optimistic about this. But ultimately, we realized that the problem was not female founder to VC, but also the VCs themselves. So the venture capitalists, what we call general partners, that were not getting robustly funded by the LPs, the limited partner investors. So when you think about the role of a VC fund manager, he or she is just a money manager, right? Not everybody is rich from the get-go, which is the impression and the wrong impression. But as the lawyers know, the business model is you get management fees. So it's a 220. And until you get that funds under management, right, you're making very, very little. And in the recent years, there's been an explosion of new managers, and they were, many of them were women, people of color. And what we're sort of seeing is the reality of how access and privilege has impacted the funding sort of landscape as well. Because if you think about the questions that the limited partner investors ask in funding the funds, right? So who are these limited partner investors? These are endowments, right? University endowments. You're thinking about pension funds. You're thinking about financial institutions, of course, family offices, and high net worth individuals as well. But for the more institutional that write the bigger checks, that help really fund the venture ecosystem, many of them require a 10-year track record. But if you think about the new managers that are coming into the scene that will outperform, there's studies that show that first-time fund managers outperform, they don't necessarily look like the status quo, right? They look more like you and I around the table, but the system has not been sort of designed to look at that as a pattern of success, right? So when I talk about sort of this issue of the barriers to funding, I sort of think about the metaphor of an internship and how the intern is looking for job experience. But before getting that job experience, the person who's employing this intern will say, well, where's your job experience before giving the internship? And this is the same case with the track record, right? And there's a lot of different layers to that. But when I talk about structural changes, it's little things like that, right? That's an example of how women and people of color can be held back by using patterns of success that does not include us. And that's a big one, right? And it's even, so those are real structures that you can change. And I always say this, there's a lot of unconscious bias training in the US, and now even we're going a step further into complicit bias training, right? But what really will change, because all of us around the table are biased, right? Because we've been socialized in a certain way. And we can do the most amount of unconscious and conscious bias trainings that we can. But what really will make the change, I believe, in a sustainable fashion, to answer your question, that is to really question and inquire, what are the structures that currently hold all these biases in place, right? The track record is one an example. And in every day, a lot of times, sometimes we feel that we're powerless, right? I'm just a cog in a wheel. But in so many ways, if you're in the investment world, even if you're a lawyer that's looking at certain checklists, there's so many layers of what you can do to advocate for changes that will really move us forward. And that's part of the work that I do. Today with Beyond the Billion, we work with a lot of CIOs, so chief investment officers, in looking at what does this look like? How do I drive returns through diversity? What does this mean? And I like to quote one of our foundation CIOs that we worked with recently from the Kresge Foundation. The CIO is John Barker. And he said this, which sounds very obvious, but give me a second here and think about it. To expand opportunities, you need to dismantle the barriers that exist. And when you hear that, you're like, yeah, of course, that makes total sense. But when you look at it from that lens, in the work that you do, there's so much to unpack there. And I think it really starts with this. It starts with us questioning the lens to which we implement our work and how that can truly change the landscape. And, that's what really inspires me, because once we unlock some of these structures that are holding us back, things are truly going to change. Because let me assure you, the talent is not the issue. Talent is universal, but opportunity truly is not.
Well said. I think that everything that you just said is true for the tech industry, but it's true for so many other industries, including the legal industry. I think anytime you're having a conversation about equity, you're necessarily having a conversation about access and privilege, right? And I 100% agree that the real change has to be structural and systemic, and everything that you're doing makes it sustainable. So Jason, I want to go back to you. One thing that Sarah said in her introduction, I thought reminded me of something that the Tech NYC is all about. She talked about the point at which she was working in Malaysia, trying to connect the private sector with government and, bringing all of these different actors together. And I understand from my reading about Tech NYC that as a nonprofit, you're kind of doing the same in New York in interacting with the government, your member companies around advocacy and policy. So can you tell the audience about that?
Yeah, sure. So Tech NYC is a relatively young organization, but in the short amount of time, it's been able to, develop a pretty strong backing. So Tech NYC is made up of approximately 800 tech companies, as well as VC capital funds. And the whole idea is to make New York the best place in the world to be able to build and grow a tech company. And the way we do that is on a variety of fronts. So one of it, I think, to your point, is figuring out ways that we can be able to champion policies that are going to make it easier for founders and tech leaders to be successful here. Like, one of the things I think about a lot is that there is this amazing tech hub that's in Brooklyn in the Navy Yard, right? But one of the reasons why it's so successful is because there are certain carve-outs that are made in that particular region so that they can be able to test different types of technologies that can, really be successful. But some of the things, for example, when you're talking about drones or what have you, they were, many of them started and were built in particular areas like that. So that's why we think that, policy plays a key role in a lot of these things. But in addition to that, a lot of what we try to do from the government standpoint is just make sure that, we're unclogging the bureaucratic part that, we all know and love about, government, whether it's on the city, state, federal, whatever side, right? Because, we have, many times, for example, whether it's, some of the deputy mayors or, the chancellor or, folks within city government, let's say, for example, they'll reach out to us because one, they may have a particular issue that they're having a challenge with and hoping that maybe one of our members can be able to assist with being able to find a solution to it. Or two, a workforce development program, which we've been doing a lot of work with, which kind of goes into the points I'd made before about making sure that there is a pipeline of opportunity for folks, especially from underrepresented backgrounds, to be able to get into technology. So how can we be able to assist their goals and their initiatives like in these type of spaces? So a lot of what we do is try to figure out ways that we can galvanize the tech community, given that, there's so many members of New York's tech community that are a part of our organization. But what we also try to do is make sure that there are clear lines of communication so that as we're talking about different policies that may be looked at on the state level, on the city level, that can have impact, that, we're figuring out ways to be able to support them. So there are a lot of other pieces that we work on, but the advocacy and champion and figuring out ways to work with government is definitely, one of the staples.
So just a follow-up question. Do you find that the sort of barriers that, say, a larger company, you have some really mega companies that are your members, are different than, say, an early stage company? And if so, like, how do they differ and how does that impact your strategy?
Yeah, 1,000%. I mean, let's say, for example, one of our, and I don't think I'll just say, let's say Google, right? Google's one of our members, right? There's certain things that we work on together, but, they have teams, they have armies of folks, who already have relationships or connecting with technology, right? But at the same time, some of the things that, especially with Google, that they're very bullish on is making sure that we're turning libraries into, innovation hubs that are out there, right? Or figuring out ways that we can be able to support and help, CUNY or the city. I'm not sure how many folks are here from New York or how many folks are, outside of New York, but that's our, city university system here, right? Making sure that the 4,000 individuals who graduate every single year with a technology degree have a pipeline to be able to work at some of these established companies once they get started, right? So those are some of the things that you may look at from there, because and generally for many of our large members, they want folks to be able to see and recognize, all the possibilities that technology can provide, and figuring out way that we could be able to tap into some of the things that Sarah had also mentioned about the importance of, equity and inclusion, because these aren't just issues that you want to do just because it's, charity, as they said, but it's about, this is the type of things that make good business sense. So how do we figure out ways to make that a little bit easier, right? But at the same time, if you're talking to a smaller company, I mean, if you want to figure out, if you have a great idea as to to make the city be able to work better, to help transit deserts, to help underbanked communities, to help housing in some type of way that uses technology, if you want to go through the procurement process through the city or the state, it may make you, tear out all your hair, right? So a lot of what we'll try to do sometimes there is figure out ways that we can be able to make it easier for, some of the emerging companies to be successful, based on some of the work and the relationships, that we've been able to develop.
That's great. Sarah, Jason just talked about sort of this is good business sense. And one of the things that I loved in reading about some of the articles that you've written, interviews you've given, is that you kind of de-risk this notion and you talk about all the ways that women-led companies outperform, women innovators outperform. Can you just kind of share some of that? Because I think it's really compelling to people who would be attracted to what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. In some ways we're lucky to be doing this work because the news has always been on the positive end, and part of the reason why, someone asked me this, right? Do you actually think that women are better? And I'm always careful with this response, but what I like to often put forward is the notion that, the likelihood of a woman getting through to and through the doors to be in the big tables of finance and technology and venture capital and all of that means that she has to be really, really good at what she does, right? So in itself, you're really getting a creme de la creme in your pool there. And there's no question as to when, you look at this, right? The stats of women even as fund managers, women as startups, they outperform by leaps and bounds because you're truly getting the best in class. I mean, because it's so hard still, the likelihood of you finding a winner is a lot higher when you're investing in women. And that's not to say that men are bad, but what we like to say is that we are better together. And I always come from the perspective that it is all about diversity, right? Right now I'm working from a point of view of gender, because of course, with the diversity of gender, that does bring different styles, different viewpoints, but of course it stretches beyond that, right? Ethnicity, background, social class, it's truly when we come to the table with our unique lens and we can be who we are and raise our voice with everything that we bring to the table is when I truly believe we get to the best solution when faced with a challenge. But of course, even in managing that's a whole topic altogether and it's challenging. But I'll share with you a couple of stats that really continue to blow me out of the water. When we started the $1 billion fund for women, the idea was to get funds to pledge a dollar amount that they self-declare to be invested in women-founded companies within a time frame. Right? We didn't say, okay, it has to be 50% of your fund. We didn't say it has to be a minimum 100 million. We wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to buy in. And I'll use a case study to sort of bring this all to the point here. Gobi Partners, one of our key partners that signed on 1.2 billion assets under management in Asia, decided to do 50 million in under 2 years, which, as some of you in global businesses know, in Asia, that's a lot actually in 2 years to be deployed in emerging markets, right? And they not only did that, but they actually continued to see the great news that we were all telling them. I mean, there's so many stats out there, and I'm happy to share that, right? From women delivering twice the revenues, when even though they're getting half the investments, Mass Challenge, BCG, so many studies that show this. First round capital and the 10-year studies that they evaluated saw how women, gender diverse teams were outperforming. But within our funds itself, I think the data is most compelling because they then realize, okay, fine, let's do this. Let's do this publicly as well. So we didn't force our funds to make the pledge publicly. It was up to them to choose whether they wanted to declare the amount that they were going to invest. Because of course, for us, it was never a blame or shame. It was to inspire positive action. And within the 2 years, they started looking, when we asked for their data, they also started going a little bit deeper and realized that, hey, not only are these gender diverse teams outperforming, because of course in their portfolio they still had all male teams and gender diverse teams as a comparison, 94% of the gender diverse teams were getting up rounds, and that means higher valuations, and it's an important metric for private investors. All of the gender diverse teams had higher retention rates, staff retention rates. And I think you and I know why that is, right? When the teams are diverse, the likelihood of there being a way to, bring out positive action and collaborate, is a lot stronger. And women as leaders tend to have that approach, right? To be able to work with others and empower others to do more. And with that also triple the revenues, right? So they were seeing their own data. So this was not data that, I was, churning out and bringing it back to them from like the landscape of America. It was their own data and they were seeing this. And now they're fully bought in because not only are the gender diverse teams outperforming, which is very good for a VC firm that's looking to deliver returns to the LPs, LP capitals, the limited partners that are representing endowments, sovereign wealth funds, financial institutions today are pressured as well to be thinking about this lens, right, of DEI, of ESG, and we're looking for ways to channel capital that was going to create not only great returns, but also great and positive impact in the world. And that was, a no-brainer for them, right? If you want to get money to continue to invest, do the right thing. And finally, I think, what was also compelling was that they saw the great opportunity of just being really focused, right? People say it's a niche, but remember, women are 50% of the population. But they decided to double down and raise another fund. It's small, it's 10 million, but that's still a lot in Indonesia, solely focused on female founders, right? So this is a case study of someone that just decided to, frankly, take a leap of faith with me with this great idea. I thought at that time of, $1 billion, and maybe you can sign on, help me, and let's bring this agenda to the world. Saw their own results. And by the way, this firm is led by men, right? They saw their own results and are continuing to do the great work, because guess what? This is a business strategy and this is a growth strategy. And I think when we continue to mainstream this idea of investing in women and investing in diversity, not as a separate bucket, but truly as part of, what we have to do, right? To really get to the best ideas, the best innovation, and really the best returns, things are really going to change.
Well said. I heard a speaker kind of say that, at the heart of all of this is better decision-making, right? And better performance. And that's why people should be thinking about it as a business priority. That you want better decision-making, you want better performance. And McKinsey has done studies on this going back years, on companies and how companies with diverse leadership teams outperform by far. So that's very interesting. But I have to ask you a follow-up question. I'm always curious when people make pledges about sort of the accountability on the back end, right? So we all heard a lot of pledges being made in 2020. You've gotten a lot of pledges towards your fund. What do you do to kind of ensure accountability on the back end to make sure that people live up to what they promised to do?
Yeah, that's a great question, and appreciate you asking that. When when I started on this endeavor, for me, coming from a legal background, actually, I did law in King's College London. It was important for me to have that sense of accountability, right? If we were saying this to the world, we needed to know the real numbers. And so the mechanism in which we did that, of course, there's some element, because it's private investments. It's not like you're a, publicly traded company where a lot of these data points are out there. And in fact, a lot of them are investing into smaller companies that it's truly hard to track, right? So there's some element of self-reporting, which we did. But on top of that, one of the big partnerships that we have that we're proud of is with PitchBook. And they're the premier data provider in the world, starting with the US. And what we did was we actually looked at all the transactions by our partner funds. And what they did, PitchBook as a whole, what they do is they have analysts on the ground that are tracking each transaction that's being done, right? So the global volume of VC funding transactions that are happening, they're tracking that. And what we do is we actually have an independent verifier in some way to verify that, hey, these were the transactions done. And actually, I'm happy that you brought that up, because I almost forgot to mention this. But when we looked at the transactions, right, even a subset of the transactions from the first billion that was deployed in those 2 years, 4 billion was the total capital that was raised by these same companies, right? So talk about catalytic capital and the flywheel effect. And these were only surfaced with the help of people like PitchBook that had analysts on the ground that are doing the work and really examining a lot of this. And also every year we publish a report with them. And this is coming out actually next week, hopefully, fingers crossed. Been working hard on this with them. But it's a female founder report on the state of female founders and funders in the US VC ecosystem. So using a little bit of, sort of self-reported data to give the context, plus some data, and also looking at what's been reported through PitchBook. And also in Asia, we use Deal Street Asia, that's part of the Nikkei group. We've got our tentacles in different ways to check some of that. On your question on how can we ensure that they do the full amount, that's a really hard one. And someone, it was a strategic question that someone had asked us earlier on as well. Do you want to actually name and shame those that didn't meet their pledges? And of course, from the numbers that I shared with you, from the first billion, 638 million of that was deployed. So it wasn't the full amount, right? So obviously there were firms that didn't deploy the amount. And I think we decided, Shelly and I, my co-founder, that to be sustainable, for us to win, for us to continue to bring female founders and this agenda forward, we needed to approach it with a way where we could work with the system to change the system. And so we decided not to publicly shame those that did not meet their pledge amounts, but of course have ways to address them privately, to say, what are the real issues here? Is it, the lack of change within your evaluation mechanism to be able to generate the results, right? So as mentioned, part of, in sharing a little bit here, part of what some of our VC funds did to create these results was actually change their evaluation mechanism, right? We have two guys in Canada, loyal VC, that decided, hey, let's remove the pitch process completely. And guess what? 40% of their CEOs, not founders, are women because of that, and led by two white guys, actually. So, I think it's a hard one that I was faced with, and my co-founder was faced with, of how do we ensure that we put feet to the fire. And we decided to, for this point in time, to ensure that we inspire positive action and highlight those that have met their pledges and celebrate those successes and showcase what can be done. And in the back end, sort of work with those that have not met the amount to be able to deploy that. And that involves hiring more women partners, hiring more people of color, advancing your networks, changing the way that you're doing things currently. And that's the work that we do on a daily basis.
Okay, that's great. Jason, I want to talk to you a little bit about accountability and impact, but it seems to me from what I read about Tech NYC that a lot of your accountability is really tied to what you're able to get the government officials to do in terms of policy and the impact of those policies. If that's correct, if it's not, correct me, but if it is correct, what are some of the partnerships that you've been able to put in place to impact New York City? I was reading about how really the tech industry is really driving the economic recovery there. So I would imagine that you're very active in some of those discussions. So can you share some of that?
Yeah, sure, definitely. So I guess to set the table a little bit. So over the last 12 years, there have been approximately 114,000 jobs that have been created by tech in New York. So it is by clear and by leaps and bounds the largest creator of new jobs, like in New York. And the ironic thing is because there's so many other legacy industries that have been successful. When you think of law, when you think of media, when you talk about finance or what have you, I don't think people have necessarily seen how much it's grown. Where today there are approximately 370,000 folks who are working in tech. And in addition to that, in 2021, $55 billion was deployed to New York City headquartered tech companies, which was almost 3 times what it was the year before. And certainly I think part of that relates to, I think, the pandemic, where, folks had to figure out, new ways to be able to work from home, to live from home, to do a lot of this stuff. And I think that in a lot of ways, some of these companies that were emerging or on certain, certain precipices, were able to, find the funding and, all these valuations that allowed them to be successful, right? But the reason I say that is that last year, as I was talking about that $55 billion, the amount that was invested, let's say, in Black founders was 4 times what it had been, in any year before, which sounds great, right? So that means it went up to 1.7%, right? And if you look at the amount that's invested in Hispanic founders in New York, it's 1.3%. And the crazy thing about it is I say that number quadruple, and I think part of that was part of this George Floyd effect that had happened before, where there was, some more of these funds that were, kind of looking to figure out ways to kind of be supportive of underrepresented folks and social impact funds and all these other things that I think have maybe helped in that sense. But obviously, that's still a drastically low number there, right? So how do you figure out ways to be able to increase that? One thing that we've been speaking with and likely be starting a partnership with is with the New York City Economic Development Corporation. This has this plan called Venture Access Program, where the idea is to figure out ways that we can get more funds to disclose, what percentage of their funding is going to underrepresented and under-resourced communities, right? So you could be able to see some of those things. And in LA, they actually have a program called Pledge LA that has been pretty successful in this space. So trying to figure out ways that may assist with being able to get more information about, what is being done and what can be done. I think the other thing too is that, and I'm cautiously optimistic about where this may lead and what this will look like in the future. There have been a number of folks that I've met during this past year that have, first time funds of, $50 million of assets under management, right? And I'm hoping if those are successful, and actually I should say that these are funds that are specifically focused on helping, underrepresented founders, find success, or folks who are doing things in the social impact space, which has a disproportionate number of, racial diversity as the founders that are in these types of spaces, right? So part of what I'm hoping is that as we're starting to have this conversation, maybe 2 or 3 years from now, we'll see that those funds have been able to be successful. And as a result, they've been able to go back to their LPs and then be able to make those $50 million funds become $100 million funds, and then $150 million, and be able to grow. But it is something that I've seen and I'm hopeful about, and I think that will move us in the right direction. But just clearly, there are these larger systematic and institutional issues at play that make it harder for folks of color and women founders to find the same success. So there are a lot of different ways we try to look at it. To me, a big part of it is that long-term view of figuring out ways that we can get more folks of color and more women into tech early, and that means making sure that we're investing in things such as Keenan that has, that's more reflective of the diversity that we see in New York, which means that we're making more pipeline programs that are in our high schools, which means that we're making sure that computer science is something that's taught not just, in college, but in elementary school, in middle school, and high school. In fact, there's something that the tech community started working on in New York a couple of years. It predates me, but the plan is by 2025 to make sure that all New York City public schools have computer science at every single level. And it's a program called CS for All, where it's a public-private partnership where the private sector was able to assist in raising $40 million to be able to get this off the ground and get it implemented, by the 2025 date. But I think that all of those things are what needs to be done, because at the end of the day, if you're going to look at most funds, they're going to figure out they're going to look at, what they think is going to make the most capital. And if you don't have folks of color who are being able to get to that stage where they can be able to present an idea with the data behind it to be able to get someone to invest in them, if we don't start to look at some of those indicators earlier, where it's going to be harder to be able to get the number of founders out there, to get folks who are in tech jobs, which then often tend to leave those jobs when they have an idea and then create their own company. So there are all these different pieces that we have to work on. But I'll say that, that program that, we're looking at, that the New York City Economic Development Corporation is running, is one way to do it. And, but I also think that we need to do some of the long-term work that makes sure that we're cultivating and incubating diverse talent so that they can be able to be in positions to be successful.
That's a great answer. You actually answered my next question, because I had read in your annual report where you talked about sort of the next generation of talent's going to define the future of this industry. And so I was going to ask you about your pipeline plans, but you just covered it. We have a similar crisis, I would say, in Miami. And just earlier this year, a group of young visionaries, not unlike yourselves, formed something called Tech Equity. And it's all about access to computer science education, STEM education, resources in the public schools here in Dade County. So that's very exciting.
Perfect. Good to hear.
Yeah. So Sarah, the future. Jason talked a little about what he's hoping to impact and what needs to shift with Tech NYC. What are you hoping to shift and what do you see 5 years out and beyond?
The $1 billion question, right? I mean, I think like Jason, I'm cautiously optimistic, with what's happening. I mean, during the pandemic, and that still is rearing its ugly head in different forms. Unfortunately, we did see sort of a situation of us, moving steps forward and steps back, right? So women were the hardest hit. I mean, even from a workforce point of view, a lot of the women had left the workforce, unfortunately, because of how things are. And hopefully things are changing a little bit, but we did see a dent in the numbers in terms of the progress that women have been making, especially in this downturn and, with inflationary pressures, with the US-China tension and everything else that's happening today, it is a lot of my fear is the reversion into bad patterns, right? So in times of fear, investors still, despite what we like to think of being very systematic and data driven and all of the above, there is still a human element to what we do. And, when times are challenging, the losers and the winners will be very clear. I mean, there's in the funding environment today, and I'm sure Jason is seeing somewhat the same. It's very clear who the winners are, and those winners are having no problem in this funding winter. It is not a funding winter for them, right? Because it's an easy bet to be made. It is a safe bet, and I used the example back in the day, we would say you would never be fired for hiring a McKinsey, right? CEOs will never be fired for hiring a McKinsey. And in today's age in the venture landscape, you would hardly be fired for getting into a Sequoia, even though there are things that you may not agree with, or Andreessen Horowitz, right? So I think we need to be very intentional, as Jason said, in everything that we do in the years moving forward. Times are changing rapidly. And despite more attention on issues that we all care about, right, that we're talking about today, diversity, equity, inclusion, I think more and more it's important for us to integrate that into the main rooms, right? That this is a business discussion, end of story, and that it cannot be forgotten during tough times where cuts are being made and things like that. So I'm being very cautious because I've also, I have a global lens. I was just in Singapore where we were doing a scan of the markets there and how things are trickling on. And I think some pressure is being felt there as well. So I think there's going to be a market correction, which is going to be actually important. And it's a good thing where those sky high valuations, right, that are no longer sustainable will be out of the game. And truly those that are gritty will continue on. But we must not forget that it is in times like this that women and people of color suffer the most as well. So how do we address it? And how do we create the guardrails to ensure we're not forgetting that this must be a priority for us moving forward, to reflect the diversity, to reflect the reality that we want to live in, because change is insidious. I think we've seen that in the US, right? You let one thing slide, the next thing slides, and where do we land? So being very careful about that. But of course, from a personal business point of view, I think we're starting to really see a lot of the hard work, right? The seeds that we've put in starting to bear fruit. And a lot of that looks like opportunities that we ourselves want to play a role in. And I can't say too much right now within this legal sphere as well. Very cautious of who my audience is. But safe to say that, there are a lot of great female founders, innovators, and fund managers that we're so bullish on, that we want to continue to support and fuel directly ourselves in a way with our partners to continue to move this agenda forward. And this feels like it's been a while, but as Jason says, it feels like a new organization, but it's it's a long journey, and this feels like it's been a long time coming. We've put in a lot of hard work over the years, and it feels like a lot has happened in a short amount of time, but we're still just getting started. So looking forward to continue to partner with the great capital allocators in the world, the family offices, the investors, the founders, to continue to drive returns through diversity.
That's great. Thank you so much. For the audience, we have about 3.5 minutes left. So if you have a burning question for Sarah or Jason, please put it in the chat. I know, Sarah, you have a hard stop at 4 o'clock, so we're not going to go over the time. As you were talking, it reminded me of an article that I saw earlier this week where they were predicting that CEOs are going to sort of pull back on some of their ESG commitments because of their concerns about the recession, which I think is a concern for all of us in terms of the impact that might have on some of these things that we're discussing. I guess we have a few minutes left. I'd like each of you to perhaps just take a couple of minutes, and for the people in the audience who are in varying positions in the tech industry, to just, what would you say the takeaway is? I mean, there's a lot of words that you've used today that I think are the takeaway, like being intentional, looking for ways to dismantle the barriers, thinking about impact. All of those things are relevant, but what would you say would be your sort of final words to the people in the audience? And I'll let maybe either one of you who wants to jump in.
Jason, I'll let you go first.
Sounds good. So I would say that, as you were saying before, this is a challenging time just, throughout the market downturn right now for it. But at the same time, there has been some explosive growth that we've seen over these last, 5, 10 years, especially in areas such as New York, such as Miami, such as some of these tech hubs that we've seen out here. And even though there are challenges now, and in some ways, I think that we'll be better for it. At the end, it means that for some of these companies that probably had valuations that were maybe a little too high, sometimes you need a little bit of a, times like this show that companies that are efficient, companies that have some, have great ideas, those are the ones that are going to make it through. And what I think we need to do is that even though some of this funding is not going to be even though we're going to have less funding that's out there, we got to make sure that we hold to the same standards that we had over these last couple of years as well, when, there was more money that was being deployed. So the way we do that is make sure that, we continue to have conversations like this, that, when we decide who it is that, we want to do business with, we look at what the teams look like. We look at, where the funding goes, and we make sure that, we continue to invest, in tech in ways that doesn't mean that there's just more business or more funding that's coming in, but it's being done so in a way that's equitable and allows all folks, to be able to succeed. And that means making sure that, we're doing some of these long things that we may not actually see the impact of, for a couple of years, but need to be done to ensure that as we start to rise out of this downturn or recession or whatever it is you decide you want to call it, that folks of color are in a position that they can be successful. And in turn, that also means for all these other tangential industries that, we're having those conversations when it comes to what their legal counselors, we're having this conversation about who the accountants are. We're figuring out ways to make sure that folks have opportunities to be successful, and that we're bringing on diverse folks, when we're talking about gender, when we're talking about race, so that, as things move in the right direction, we're doing so in a way that puts us in a better position than before and doesn't lead to more income inequality issues.
Thank you. And I know, Sarah, you have a hard stop. So if you want to just.
Yeah. So I'll do a short one, and I'll do it with one of my favorite quotes by Alice Walker, who some of you may know. The easiest way that we give away power is to believe that we have none. And I urge all of us around the table to question what power are you giving away, and how can you enforce that power to do the right thing, right? If not you, then who? Because if all of us lean in together and actually work together towards this mission, I think we can truly move things forward. And it is really, in each one of us to do something, because if each of us decide that, hey, this is not my area of expertise, this is not my thing, it's, Sarah's thing or Jason's thing, we frankly, I mean, I think Jason would agree with me. We can't do this alone, right? We need to have everyone around the table with us to continue to champion this, to drive for gender diversity, to fuel women-led innovation throughout all the times.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This was really interesting and wonderful presentation. So I just want to say thank you again on behalf of the Tech and Telecom Industry Sector Group. And thank you, Tiffani.